Always a lot of crows around at the end of a battle. Marching through Georgia. This is part of the Civil War campaign series. Here's another one from it, and I have one more. Kicking around Mississippi Fortress. You've perhaps seen me play them all. We're doing both the intro and review for the series as a whole. Now, I did not touch the very last piece, which is Grant Takes Command that I have. There are other games in the series that I don't have. That is really an expansion for a couple of the games that are out there. So what is the main concept behind this? What it is it's an operational system that cuts through a lot of the kind of counterintuitive stuff that I felt like Great Battles of the American Civil War throws into play. You get results of, these more, what feel like intuitive maneuvers, right? You're looking at the board trying to figure out, how do I get here? How do I get there? You're not worrying about hex by hex movement. You're worried about area movement. But the game's a little rough around the edges, and the concepts are different from most games that you're going to have played. Also, the first edition of the rules is part of that roughness, which is to say, you can do stuff in the first edition of the rules just plowing through an enemy position that is not reasonable. We saw that in Mississippi Fortress when I played it. Maybe it's explainable by Grant, but it doesn't work in the other games. And in particular, in Marching Through Georgia, it makes it impossible for Joe Johnston to defend the territory. However, in the second edition rules, which didn't come with this game, but I was lucky enough that they came with my Lee Takes Command, because otherwise I would kind of look down on the series as a whole if not for that. They presented a little fix, which is, hey, you can't just push through the enemy's line. You can't move forward through his line if he has enough troops still standing there. And that enough is a pretty low number in that game. I don't have it defined for this game, nor for Mississippi Fortress, although I think they were present in an online version. Another issue is the packaging of the games. They come with a bunch of optional counters. Let me see. I got a whole bunch of optional counters that came in my set. No rules to go with them. Apparently those rules, like other things, come out in the company's house organ, which is not a particularly good way to give you, the appropriate value. You're buying a boxed game, you should get most of, what was designed for it, right? And at the very least, long after the company is no longer selling those modules, they should post the rules for the expanded counters that you get with your game. That's the big cost, right? It's producing the counters. But at the very least, they could throw it in an electronic form, so they don't have to charge you for the paper, so that they don't have to pay anything. They have the intellectual property rights for it, and just throw those extra rules in. Because instead, you may not have all the what-if scenarios that you want. So, I bought these used, so I can't complain too much. Although I did kind of hunt them down, and they're not like I bought them at really, really low prices. But they're also not incredibly hard to find games for the most part at a reasonable price. So, whatever. All right. How about another grouse about it? The damn maps. These Rick Barber maps, I think it's Rick Barber, yeah. They're almost impossible to figure one terrain from another, to the extent that they had to publish an errata telling you how to read the damn map for this one. And as it was, they already put a list of all the terrains of a certain type in here. It's just the visibility of his pencil work, where basically every terrain space in the game contains something that looks like each of the different terrain types that there is. Even rivers, okay? I mean, maybe it's pretty, maybe it's not. That's a matter of artistic taste. I would say it looks kind of like a 7-year-old or 5-year-old drew it with colored pencils. I don't know if that's a terrible thing. It's kind of appealing. It's certainly more natural looking than a lot of wargame maps are, but it is not terribly useful. In particular, it's hard to fucking read the map. The game also comes with some counters that are kind of not optional, but degrade the way the game would be played if you actually used them. Things like the ineffective unit counters, which destroy the hidden, the double blind variant aspect of the game, which is a very important part of the game. This is a game about keeping your forces somewhat hidden, probing to determine what the enemy has, so you understand where the enemy is, and utilizing the terrain for defensive purposes or in terms of trying to go around those defensive purposes. Especially the marching through Georgia, but almost all of them are really very much that operational level that seems correct. I got me a force, I'm trying to put it in the way of somebody who's trying to do something and make him attack me, right? I don't feel like anything's that fucking clear-cut when I look at great campaigns of the American Civil War. I feel like I'm diddling around with little stacks and trying to find the little singular choke points and stuff at the hexagon level, which is far, far more detailed than this, which handles these kind of broad movements that seem appropriate for an operational level game to me. Yeah, I know, I play plenty of strategic level games that have little hexagons, right? Sure. But usually you're not worried, in those games, you're not all that worried about, ooh, can I block this pass? You know, this little bit of terrain, do I have everything covered? You do have some of that here, though. And that's actually one of the things. I think every one of these games you can lose due to making a stupid mistake, not setting up your defensive lines exactly how they have to be. You know, not seeing that the enemy can slip something through, because in this one with its supply rules, it's more limited than most of them in terms of how the attacker can get through your line. But that limitation makes it seem like, I'm safe because of this, I've got the line here, and then, damn, you got Cav coming in. Apparently, in one of the many, I guess one of these Art of the Anal, ends up, I'm told, ends up giving rules to create a garrison for the railway, so that the Union doesn't just lose the game because maybe they fell behind on the Cav race. Basically, I lost some Cav battles in addition to making a mistake in my advance, and you know what? The Rebs just managed to basically threaten Sherman's entire supply line and take it out with that. Disappointing? No. It was kind of exciting, actually. I had fun with it. I would have more fun opposed with something like that. I find myself just pissed at myself for making such a stupid error when I'm playing solo. When I'm playing opposed, I still am pissed at myself if I'm the one making the error. But, you know, in either case, there's sort of this, these generals actually made mistakes in real life. Just because we're looking at a scenario situation that played out a certain way, it doesn't mean somebody couldn't have blundered. And kind of the hope in a war game is that the blunders kind of play out equally on each side. They didn't in this, but okay. And I tend to cut and reverse certain errors anyway, and this was one that couldn't be really, so that may also be a factor. which is one reason to never take anything back, but whatever. Um, yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for me is that I find this a very intuitive view of something that I'm not that interested in, which is operational maneuvers. But this makes more sense to me than when I'm dealing with, when I'm dealing with the hexagon movement in the Great Campaigns, or when I'm dealing with stupid bubble maps like I am in, some of the CDGs that are operational in nature. This has nice areas. Areas seem to capture the right level for the way that you apply force in this game. But yeah, and they give you the right level. So the thing is, even as the commander who owns the troops, or the overall commander whose troops they are, I don't want to go into ownership of troops. You probably don't know exactly where your forces are, which is one reason why hexagons and all that detail kind of don't make a lot of sense in games. And it's one thing that I kind of like about area movement games. Unless you're gonna, take it down to the level where you basically have something where you're moving along, large stretches of terrain that's all mapped out and all known. And you can scale down, to the tactical and play that out on that level with exactly the right information. I think a rough approximation is actually a better type of game, and it allows you to show the kind of terrain, the impact of the terrain without having to come up with a lot of specific different, movement rules for different terrain types. Yes, there are like 4 different terrain types in here, and probably most hex games are going to have about the same. But they're not going to convey the same information that the drawing of the river, of the terrain to the river lines, and the combination of, the shape and size of the terrain with what it contains and all that. All that information gives you a ton of capability to make the system kind of simple. Therefore, units move 1 space per turn. That's real simple. What's not so simple is when you start getting into the rules of, how do I get out of the space? What units can push through, what other units, stuff like that. What's interception like? So the complexity is all still there. It's not like that gets wiped away at all. It just, those complexities make more sense to me, even if they don't necessarily gel in my brain. And that not gelling in my brain, it's hard to tell what it is, whether or not it's the rule book itself, or the concept being not entirely, like I say, it's intuitive, but I'm not sure the concepts are all that intuitively obvious. For example, the idea that, yes, I attacked, therefore I should be able to move, and I would not be allowed to move my infantry unless it fought a round of battle as an aggressor. That seems a little weird, especially when you can't even withdraw from combat, under most rules. This one has special rules. So there's some kind of wanky things in it that I'm I'm not sure. I kind of see why they were done and why they're the only option to control the game, but they don't quite have it right. And attempts to modify that and refine that basic concept, like the troop density rules that say, look, not only do you have to attack, but in order to push through the enemy, there can't be many of them left, and some other specifics. There's a lot of little, very detailed little pieces to it that aren't so intuitive after all, even if the general feel of the game in terms of how you're actually playing it, where you want to put your units and everything, feels much more intuitive. So in a way, I kind of feel like the rules to this are harder to approach. Is that just a matter of maybe the rules not being written or not sinking into me too much? Or is it more a matter of, this is essentially a system, right, of a nature that's about equivalent to I said this before, the standard combat series that the gamers have, which is basically all the operational games that kind of were made with a fairly simplistic hex and counter system and a CRT and everything. That's basically what that what that series encompasses. This feels like it's encompassing a similarly large space. Say we reduced that to World War II operational games, because standard combat series really lives in that space, even though they can go off of it. This could also be extended into different periods that are somewhat similar. Like standard combat series goes into World War I and other 20th century conflicts. Well, this could go into Franco-Prussian War or something like that, and probably play about the same, because some of the same basic concepts are there. But what it means is that each particular instance of the game, each of the scenarios that comes out in it, has a fairly heavy burden of additional rules. So for example, this one, it's the only one with supply. Why? Well, because the spaces, this is another thing, the scale of the games is different. The spaces represented in this are larger, the length of the turns is larger, and you're talking about going over a much larger scale. 7 days battle is 2 turns in this. It's only 14 turns in that game. But yeah, we're talking about a changing in scale from from 2 turns a day to 1 turn every 3 days. That's what I would call a system shouldn't be able to handle that much variance, right? Unless it's incredibly abstracted, and I don't feel like this is. So in order to handle these scale differences, the differences in the specifics in each game, there ends up being a significant amount of additional work. And, there's this core system that sort of says something, but that core system is about at the level that, standard combat series is. Where, wow, you could make some significantly different games based on this. And you're willing to put out, no page numbers. But yeah, I can do a quick count, but I don't know how much value that is. A 16-page rule book on on the specific rules. Sure, there are a lot of games that have something like that, especially even games where there's not a lot of difference from the just to present the scenarios in the game. But yeah, there's a fair amount of difference in each of these. Mississippi Fortress has special terrain types, as does Lee Takes Command, where the attacker, it's kind of like rough, but it's kind of worse. It's like this fortified terrain. Here they have a specialized terrain type that's Atlanta that just kind of gives you entrenchments everywhere. It doesn't give you the same kind of, if I recall correctly, must withdraw if you're not there, which is kind of like river lines are. Basically, there's certain defensive terrain that is treated very differently from the rest of the core game. I felt like mobility was very different in the different games. I don't know what else. Another thing that bothers people I know, and I was feeling kind of perturbed by it, is you have to keep track of your casualties on a piece of paper. And that's important because, or potentially important, you could get around it by using dummy counters and stuff. More dummy counters than the game already does. But because the counters are flipped over and you can't see what's what, so a strength point marker under units would either require that every counter in the game have a strength point value to it, or every counter in the game, or you'd expose what are real and what aren't real counters. Now, the game already gives you some counters and kind of half tells you to use these. I'm not sure how much it actually succeeds. For straggler loss and for ineffective units that blow the cover off anyway. Oh, another thing. Yeah. So this is a game design that's meant to kind of hide from your enemy what you have. Now, block games have a kind of nice, I hate block games, don't get me wrong, but block games have a kind of nice physical concept behind them, even if I don't like the way it's mechanically handled in, say, the Columbia block games, which is you stand the piece up, you know there's something there, it could be a dummy or whatever, and it's got this rotating strength point value on it, and I find those impossible to read, but I can see where if you're kind of lying down looking at the table like this, you can get some of the information that you need with the counters. This uses everything's flipped over, similar to Vietnam, which I recently played. The everything's flipped over has a problem, which is, as the player who should know where your stuff is, you don't know where your stuff is unless you unflip everything. And you kind of can't do that and have your opponent looking at the board. I don't think there's a good answer for this. There might be. Here are some possibilities. One is the midway style boards where, you're not really, your opponent doesn't have any idea where you are unless you guys are in some sort of contact. Unless there's something to trigger the fact that, hey, I get to know where you are. The problem with that is you kind of have to be able to call out, hey, are you here, are you there? Another way is to use force agglomeration counters. The way that Empires in Arms, Zucker's Napoleonics, a number of different games have them, where there's one counter that says, I'm this, and you flip that over and it tells you what it is, and then you have like little force tables over here. I don't know how much that helps. That would be very helpful with things that kind of stand up so only you could see it. But the problem is, then you're just kind of, if you have this, you have a unit and you flip it over and you see what it is, but you have that same problem where you don't immediately assess the information. And what's worse is, what's valuable in this is I can flip over all my stacks, look at them, and see where I want to move them. Now that works fine solo, and it actually maintains a certain degree of, I have a failure to assess information when I flip my counters over. I really do. I usually can't remember what my opponent's done, what they're doing. I surprised myself big time a couple of times in the game. And where I can't do that, I roll some dice to say, I don't know if this is a good idea, but whatever. But that doesn't work when you're sitting across the table from somebody. You have to ask that person to go look away or go into another room or something. That's no fun. I mean, you could play over Vassal. You could even play it as a LAN party for all it matters. But that's not why we play board games. And it's one of the problems with double blind systems. I enjoyed this the one time I played it opposed. Actually, I was both infuriated and intrigued by it. I didn't really enjoy it. I hated it. I have enjoyed it since I picked these up and started playing around with them. I think it's a really cool system. I think it's got some rough edges that need to be polished. This is not a game to pick up and start playing. If you're the modern type of gamer who's like, I can't tell if they mean this or that, forget it. The rules are not that polished. You're going to be left with quite a few questions, and you're going to have to make decisions on those. There's not, a significant amount of errata or re-explanations or anything. And you have to use some common sense to figure that out. If you're someone who likes to try to break games, well, maybe this is the perfect one from you. I've had people who are like, oh no, the rule says this, even though that's idiotic, I'm going to do that. Okay. Yeah, I feel like an idiot today. So then the one thing that I was thinking was, I think Clash of Arms could do, they don't seem to be into reprints though, but they could do something very cool and put these back out, re-release them with all the expansions material in them. Would people buy them? I don't know. You know, there's a lot of interest out there in repubs, but probably not for things like this. This was just never that mainstream. You know, it's like, yeah, great campaigns in the American Civil War, greatest game ever, you know, and people are saying that, and I'm like, sort of so. So this is definitely better for me, you know, at least from what I played of it. I liked Lee versus Grant, but that was a very specific situation. That game was, and it was still hard. But it felt, I don't know, it may have to do with some of the graphics that my Stonewall Jackson's Way or whatever had. It just looked so dull. This doesn't look dull. Anyway, I'm just babbling and I don't think I'm saying anything interesting, so I'm gonna put this up. I might end up playing, I hope to end up playing the Grant Takes Command, but I got a couple of things I want to do first.